My project examined forwards and futures contracts and how they can be used by global companies to hedge their cash flows which are exposed to exchange rate risks. I chose a well-known company, Caterpillar Inc., to provide examples of how to properly hedge cash inflows and cash outflows. There are a multitude of factors that can adversely affect cash flows of global companies and are not limited to nation income, political risk, changing interest rates, tariffs, foreign competition, domestic policy, and exchange rate risk. Global companies' cash flows are exposed to the risks mentioned above for each country and regions they conduct business in. This project specifically focuses on exchange rate risks that global companies face regarding their cash inflows or revenues and cash outflows or expenses. As discussed in the last slide, exchange rate risk is one of the main risks faced by global companies, and there are two forms. Transaction exposure is the sensitivity of the company's business transactions in foreign currencies to exchange rate movements. This is far more common than translation exposure, and it affects the payables and receivables the company anticipates for its business and operations. Translation exposure has to do with financial reporting requirements. U.S. companies, per SEC regulations, must submit quarter and annual reports. All foreign currency denominations must be expressed in U.S. dollars, but since exchange rates adjust over time, income reported in U.S. dollars can change with fluctuating exchange rates. This slide provides examples of how exchange rate fluctuations can change receivables and payables for a global company. As the slide depicts, for receivables, an appreciation of home currency lowers firm value, while a depreciation of home currency increases firm value. When dealing with receivables or cash inflows, the company's firm value will increase if the US dollar depreciates and will decrease if the US dollar appreciates. When dealing with payables or cash outflows, the company's firm value will increase if the US dollar appreciates. Remember, payables are expenses, and would decrease if the US dollar depreciates. In order to hedge against fluctuating exchange rates, companies often negotiate forward contracts with banks or purchase futures contracts on the exchange. This chart is from Jeff Madura's International Financial Management book, and it identifies the main differences between forward contracts and futures contracts. Forward contracts are negotiated with financial banks and are tailor-fitted to the company's specific needs, but they are less liquid and usually held to delivery. Futures contracts are traded on exchanges. They require deposits and margins, but they also have some liquidity to them. You can close out your futures contract by entering a reverse position. For example, if you entered a long futures contract, you could then enter a short futures contract to cancel out your positions. Long positions are obligations to purchase or buy an underlying asset or security, while short positions are obligations to sell or deliver an underlying asset or security. Since futures contracts are established by the exchange, oftentimes the amount a company needs to hedge won't be divisible by the contract size. For instance, if a company needs to hedge $750, but the contract size per futures contract is $200, then they will either need to buy 3 futures contracts to hedge $600, or buy 4 contracts to hedge $800, which is more than what is needed. This example explains one of the main benefits of forward contracts. They are negotiated based on the company's needs. In order to hedge against exchange rates, companies can either negotiate into a forward contract or obtain a futures contract on the exchange. To hedge payables or cash outflows, a company would need to assume a long position, which is the obligation to buy foreign currency at an agreed upon exchange rate on the delivery date. In this position, a company's profit is determined by the spot rate at delivery minus the exchange rate agreed upon in the contract. If the spot rate at delivery is above the agreed upon exchange rate, the firm's value will increase by that amount. However, if the spot rate falls, the firm's value will decrease because if it didn't hedge, it would have been able to purchase the foreign currency at a lower exchange rate than the agreed upon rate. To hedge receivables or cash inflows, a company would need to assume a short position, which is the obligation to sell foreign currency at an agreed upon exchange rate on the delivery date. In this position, a company's profit is determined by the exchange rate agreed upon in the contract minus the spot rate on the delivery date. If the exchange rate agreed upon in a contract is greater than the spot rate at the delivery date, then the firm's value will increase by that amount. If by the delivery date the spot price is above the agreed upon exchange rate in the contract, the firm's value will decrease by that amount. This is because if it didn't enter into the contract, it could use the more lucrative spot rate to receive more US dollars while exchanging the foreign currency. Caterpillar Inc. is a global company that operates in about 180 countries across the globe. They are a large producer of industrial equipment and they provide services and products relating to construction and mining. They have four main segments, and those are construction industries, resource industries, energy and transportation industries, and financial products. Caterpillar operates around the globe, and their 10K identifies four main regions for their operations. Those four regions are North America, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia Pacific. Per their 10K, nearly half of Caterpillar's revenues came from regions outside of North America, which indicates that their cash flows are highly exposed to exchange rate fluctuations. So how exactly can Caterpillar use forwards or futures to hedge against fluctuating exchange rates? Here are presented two different opportunities that Caterpillar has to hedge against exchange rate movements. The first thing we need to do is to identify if these are cash inflows or cash outflows. Example 1 is a cash outflow because Caterpillar is purchasing or spending money on steel in a foreign currency, and therefore Caterpillar would need to purchase CNY or Chinese yuan forward or enter a long position. Example 2 is a cash inflow because the company is going to be receiving 100 million Indian rupees. To hedge against that, Caterpillar would need to sell that currency forward or enter a short position. In order to hedge against payables, Caterpillar will need to purchase CNY or Chinese yuan forward to cover its position against the CNY appreciating against the US dollar, which will make the purchase more expensive for the firm if it's not hedged. Unfortunately, per the CME, futures contract sizes are 1 million Chinese yuan, so they will not be able to use futures contracts in this scenario. They will have to use a forward contract. The company would negotiate a forward contract to hedge. The negotiated forward contract rate was agreed upon as 1 Chinese yuan equals 0.140782 US dollars. You can clearly see that setting up a forward contract and hedging the purchase enables Caterpillar to know that it will not pay any more than 77,430 for the steel purchase. This is very helpful for budgeting purposes and management. If the Chinese yuan does appreciate against the US dollar, the firm's value will increase because it will still be able to purchase the steel using the lower exchange rate. However, if the Chinese yuan depreciates, Caterpillar would still have to buy steel for the higher price of 77,430 as explained in the slide. If it had been able to enter into a futures contract, once the company realized that the Chinese yuan wasn't appreciating against the US dollar, they could have canceled their futures contract by reversing their position and hopefully been able to capitalize to some degree on the fortuitous exchange rate movement. Caterpillar will need to sell currency forward to hedge against receivables. In this scenario, Caterpillar will need to sell 100 million Indian rupees forward to hedge against the possibility that Indian rupees depreciates against the US dollar, which would adversely affect its cash inflows in 45 days. Caterpillar can sell Indian rupees forward using futures contracts or entering a short position because Indian rupees futures contracts are 500 million per contract. So Caterpillar will need 20 short futures contracts to hedge their position. However, since the order is due within 45 days and the delivery dates of futures contracts are standardized by the exchange and usually every 30 days, the two won't match, which is a reason why forward contracts are sometimes more sought after because you can tailor fit the delivery dates. Caterpillar can sell 20 futures contracts of Indian rupees, and before the delivery date in 30 days, they can either cancel out that position or hold to delivery if it causes the firm's value to increase. If the firm chooses to sell the Indian rupees at 30 days instead of canceling out their position, they are still not hedged against any exchange rate movements from day 31 to day 45 when the order is due. Caterpillar could also negotiate a forward contract to sell 100 million Indian rupees in 45 days for an agreed upon rate, thus locking in the exchange rate that will be used in 45 days while ensuring there is no overlap between the delivery date of the contract and the due date for the order. However, this advantage is mitigated by the fact that it is very difficult to cancel your position if the Indian rupees appreciates against the US dollar. You can sell currency forward using futures contracts to hedge against the 100 million INR receivables. When hedged, the firm's value increases if the foreign currency depreciates against the US dollar, because the firm can exchange the foreign currency at the higher exchange rate. When hedged, the firm's value decreases when the foreign currency appreciates against the US dollar, because the firm will have to exchange the foreign currency at the lower exchange rate. However, with futures contracts, you are able to close out your position by reversing it. This liquidity can enable companies to hedge risk and then reassess exchange rate movements. If the INR ends up appreciating against the US dollar before the end of the contract, and Caterpillar anticipates this to continue, the company can purchase 20 long positions and cancel out its original 20 short positions. It can then take advantage of the fortuitous appreciation of the Indian rupee against the US dollar. Although hedging can be used to mitigate losses, by locking in the exchange rate that we use for transaction, it can also lead to less profits. Financial managers must weigh their options and be aware of overhedging. No financial manager wants to report that the firm lost $2 million in firm value because he or she decided to negotiate into a forward contract and then the company didn't see the benefits of a fortuitous move in exchange rates. Remember, the main goal of a corporation is to increase the shareholder wealth. Although forwards can be tailor-made to fit specific company needs, they lack the liquidity of futures contracts and the ability to close out positions if things go negatively. For transactions where financial managers feel there is less of an adverse move in exchange rates, perhaps a forward contract is more appropriate. If a financial manager believes there's a greater risk in extreme exchange rate fluctuations, then perhaps a futures contract is more appropriate, given it comes with more liquidity and the ability to close out by reversing positions. We did discuss that oftentimes futures contracts can't completely hedge payables or receivables because their amounts are limited by the exchange. In a perfect world, companies might use both a futures contract and then a forward contract to cover the remaining payable or receivable to ensure their positions are completely hedged and with some liquidity. CFOs and financial managers should use both forward and futures contracts to mitigate exchange rate fluctuations that can adversely affect cash inflows and outflows, and their decisions should be made in unison with knowledge of country or regional risks, interest rates, and a greater comprehension of the overall global economy.